Australian couple Caitlin O'Brien and Shay Sturt had a contentious relationship spanning over a decade. The first domestic incident reported to the police was in 2008, when an argument about moving furniture in O'Brien's Melbourne apartment turned violent. The young woman told local law enforcement that Sturt had struck her, but she later withdrew the complaint. O'Brien, who worked as a nurse, reportedly fled from her home following another violent altercation 2 years later. Sturt had become agitated after O'Brien suggested he might need psychological help. He went on to pull her by the hair and punch her several times before she escaped. The man consequently faced assault charges but was placed on an adjourned good behavior bond. In the years that followed, O'Brien made over 30 visits to her general practitioner due to injuries she sustained from her partner's physical attacks. Following each domestic episode, she would report Sturt to the police only to be manipulated into dropping the case. Sturt was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia-type personality disorder, which was being worsened by his excessive cannabis use. On several occasions, his mental health problems landed him in the hospital as he struggled to keep his paranoid delusions at bay. Despite Sturt's violent tendencies, O'Brien never received the help she was so desperate for, and the situation took a drastic turn in the summer of 2019. In May, O'Brien underwent a procedure to remove a tumor from her brain. She was forced to stay home throughout the recovery process, which started to put an untenable strain on her relationship with Sturt, whose condition was only worsening. He told O'Brien he thought the neighbors were worshipping Satan and that she herself was a devil. The man even made claims that he was Jesus and instructed O'Brien to eat an apple so she could be enlightened like Adam and Eve. On June the 23rd, the woman decided she'd had enough. She called the police on Sturt, who was behaving very erratically. He was taken to the Alfred Hospital, where he was detained under the Mental Health Act as doctors made their assessment. O'Brien was fearful that Sturt might murder her in the midst of a psychotic episode, a concern she expressed to him while he was in the hospital. As she was making arrangements to hide out at an ex-boyfriend's place, the hospital abruptly released Sturt, who'd somehow convinced the doctors that he was of stable mind. On June the 25th, only 2 days after he was admitted to the mental health ward, Sturt went to O'Brien's flat and unleashed a brutal attack, stabbing her with scissors, smothering her with a pillow, and tying pants tightly around her neck to ensure she was dead. While in jail awaiting the resulting murder trial, Sturt penned handwritten letters detailing the extent of his descent into madness. In the notes, he indicated that O'Brien would likely still be alive if the authorities hadn't chosen to release him after only a few hours of observation. He ultimately agreed to a plea deal and was given a 22-year prison term, of which he'd need to serve 16 years before being eligible for parole. Number 10. Alex Staines. In January of 2021, English police constables Gemma Walsh-Beasley and Mike McDermott were dispatched to investigate a domestic violence report at a home in Welwyn Garden City, Hertfordshire. 25-year-old Christy Fruin told the officers that her ex-boyfriend, Alex Staines, had harassed, stalked, and assaulted her on several occasions during their years-long relationship, and had even left their children alone in the house to track her whereabouts. At the time, 30-year-old Staines was out on bond in connection with a previous incident that led to Fruin being labeled a high-risk domestic abuse victim in law enforcement databases. Nevertheless, constables Walsh, Beasley, and McDermott declined to arrest Staines for his latest abuse and even allowed the couple's 2 youngest children to stay with him overnight. The next morning, when he went to drop the kids off at Fruin's place, he forced his way inside and grabbed a large kitchen knife. A merciless, frenzied attack ensued over the next 6 minutes. The Staines repeatedly plunged the knife into Fruin's face, neck, throat, and arm, where she had a tattoo of the man's name. Despite Fruin's cries for help to the police and Staines' past death threats against the woman, there were no barriers put in place to thwart the fatal attack. In June of 2021, Staines was jailed for life, with his minimum term set at 22 years. Constables Walsh, Beasley, and McDermott were investigated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct. It was determined that the officers had failed to adequately investigate the allegations against Staines and hadn't complied with standard procedures in regards to domestic abuse. As punishment, Walsh, Beasley, and McDermott were both issued formal written warnings. Number 9. Trevor Heitman. On August the 23rd of 2018, the police in San Diego, California, received a call from a psychiatrist concerned for the mental well-being of a family friend. "I'm calling to report an emergency. I believe there's an individual who is a danger to himself and to others." The caller told law enforcement, who subsequently dispatched 3 officers to the home of 18-year-old Trevor Heitman. The young man, who'd amassed nearly 900,000 YouTube subscribers under the alias McSkillet, was asleep upstairs when the police arrived. They spoke with his parents, who asked him to help get their son to a doctor. The teen's mother informed the officers that he'd sent her a threatening text message and ordered her to leave the house. She went on to describe Heitman's manic behavior while imploring the police to have him checked out by mental health professionals. One of the officers downplayed how involved they'd be allowed to be, given that Heitman had never been officially diagnosed with a mental disorder. The policeman added, "He has to be gravely disabled. He has to have a credible threat against somebody." A short time later, the family friend who dialed 911 arrived and pleaded with the officers to help Heitman, indicating the teen was likely to do something violent if left to his own devices. Eventually, the officers left without taking any action. Hours later, Heitman awoke and left the house, getting behind the wheel of his McLaren, which he'd purchased with a portion of his considerable YouTube earnings. He bumped into his father's vehicle on his way out of the driveway before busting through a fence and speeding off. Heitman took his McLaren onto I-805 but started driving southbound in the northbound lanes. He eventually slammed into an oncoming SUV at a speed of over 100 miles per hour. The collision killed the other motorist, her daughter, and Heitman himself. The California Highway Patrol stated that the crash caused a chain reaction that came to involve at least 5 other vehicles. While Heitman was a popular gaming YouTuber with a sizable online following and millions of dollars to his name, his state of mind had been rapidly declining leading up to the incident. He had only a few friends in real life, the majority of whom were in the process of moving away to college, leaving him at home alone in the late summer of 2020. Heitman's family announced that they'd be pursuing litigation against the city of San Diego, accusing law enforcement of not doing enough to prevent the deadly events of August the 23rd of 2018. News of the suit was accompanied by the release of body cam footage from San Diego Police's initial response to Heitman's house. Many were critical of the responding officers' seemingly uncaring and nonchalant attitude towards what they were being told was a serious situation. Number 8. Dylan Dalman. On August the 15th of 2022, Toronto Police Constable Anson Alfonso and his partner, Constable Sang Yub Lee, were called to the scene of a reported domestic incident. They spoke with 23-year-old Daniela Malia, who claimed that her ex-boyfriend had been harassing her and sending threatening text messages. The interaction, which was recorded by police-worn body cameras, lasted about 39 minutes, during which time the officers were said to have gathered sufficient evidence that provided reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offense had occurred. However, Constable Alfonso reportedly spoke with the ex-boyfriend, Dylan Dalman, for only 3 minutes before leaving and failing to take any further action to protect Malia. 3 days later, the young woman was found dead in an underground garage near Jane Street and Shepherd Avenue. Dalman had fatally shot her. He was ultimately arrested on a charge of first-degree murder, but the police constables who'd ignored Malia's cries for help also faced legal repercussions as a result of the incident. According to police tribunal records, Constable Alfonso failed to adequately investigate the domestic report, improperly considering it a he-said-she-said situation. He was also accused of providing an inaccurate account of the call to his supervisor, indicating there wasn't an imminent threat against Malia despite ample evidence that there was. When the supervisor asked Alfonso whether there was information linking either Malia or Dalman to firearms, the constable said no. However, at the time of the visit to Malia's residence, Dalman reportedly had an active firearm prohibition from past offenses. Both Alfonso and Constable Lee faced Police Act charges including deceit, neglect of duty, and making false or misleading statements. Toronto police officials revealed that Alfonso, a 4-year veteran of the force, was suspended with pay while the case made its way through the courts. As per the terms of the Police Services Act, the city's police chief met with the victim's family to inform them of his officers' alleged misconduct and to notify them of charges laid by the force's Professional Standards Unit. The president of the Toronto Police Association called the incident tragic for everyone involved and reiterated that although it's difficult, we must wait for the disciplinary process to take its course. Number 7. Joseph Koss. 38-year-old Scott Dunster from the UK had his car broken into outside his home in Eastbourne, East Sussex on New Year's Eve 2022. The burglar reportedly stole his wife's purse and also snagged the couple's joint bank card before fleeing the scene. Dunster subsequently noticed that a charge for roughly $75 had been made at an off-license store using his and his wife's card. The father of three reported both the theft and the unauthorized charge to Sussex Police, which processed the report at about 7:45 a.m. on December the 31st. In a statement later made by a department spokesperson, it was revealed that the report was then allocated to a local officer for further investigation, but Dunster claimed that he received no indication that he'd be receiving help from law enforcement. The man ultimately decided to take matters into his own hands rather than rely on the police. He went down to the shop where the burglar had used the card and was able to obtain CCTV footage of the unauthorized transaction as well as the thief himself. Dunster took screenshots of the footage and posted them to Facebook, enlisting the help of the general public in identifying the criminal. Local social media users positively identified him as 27-year-old Joseph Cass. On the afternoon of January the 2nd of 2023, Dunster's friend spotted Cass in the Eastbourne town centre. Simultaneously, Sussex officers were dealing with an unrelated incident nearby, and Dunstan was unable to reach anyone using 101, the police's non-emergency line. Seeking to bring a swift resolution, Dunster chased after Cass himself. He reportedly pursued the suspect through the town centre for about 600 yards before tackling him and pinning him to the ground with the help of security stewards. The nearby officers subsequently arrived to take Cass into custody. He was charged with fraud by false representation, to which he pleaded guilty at Brighton Magistrates Court the following day. Cass was later jailed for 35 weeks as punishment. A member of Sussex Police's Criminal Investigations Department said in a statement, "We commend the victim for being so proactive and providing us with additional information, which led to Cass's being apprehended." Dunster, however, was highly critical of the authorities' handling of his ordeal, indicating he was angry that he needed to risk his own life to catch the thief. Number 6. Stefan Selphy. In July of 2013, reports surfaced online about a pending lawsuit against the city of Eugene, Oregon. The chief of police and a police department supervisor who were accused of failing to halt harassment and abuse by one of their own officers. 44-year-old Stefan Selphy, a 17-year-old veteran of the Eugene police force, had his duties scaled back in October of 2012 as the controversy surrounding his alleged mistreatment of 6 different women, including co-workers and a fellow officer's wife, started to heat up. In December of that year, Selphy was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation into his misconduct. Back in July, a female Eugene officer had gone to her superiors to report that Selphy had been inappropriately pestering her since she was a new recruit over a decade earlier. Several other female department employees made similar complaints against the veteran officer. His creepy behavior and repeated unwanted advances had been largely overlooked over the years. In subsequent reports, it was revealed that some within the department refrained from dealing with the situation out of loyalty to Selphy's wife, who also worked for the police. The lead internal investigator called the man's actions despicable, while urging other victims of his abuse to step forward and voice their stories. On July the 24th of 2013, Selphy, who'd resigned from the force by that point, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor harassment and abuse charges and was consequently sentenced to 140 days in jail. He was also ordered to register as an offender. As his punishment was being handed down, Selphy issued an apology to the co-workers he'd victimized, stating he'd brought shame to the department and the community. The resulting lawsuit against the city and police officials was filed by 2 of Selphy's victims, identified only as Jane Doe and Jean Coe. The plaintiffs alleged that Selphy's touching and harassing of women was well known in police circles, but that supervisors had ignored the pervasive knowledge that he was a dangerous predator. The most readily available updates on the case failed to mention if any resolution had ever been reached. Number 5. The killing of Banas Mahmoud. When she was only a teenager, Banas Mahmoud from Mitcham, South London, was forced into an arranged marriage with a man from her family's hometown of Kaladzia in Iraqi Kurdistan. Her husband, who was 10 years her senior, was described as illiterate and old-fashioned. The police were called to their residence on numerous occasions throughout their marriage for reports of Banas being beaten and taken advantage of. While the young woman's relatives were aware of the violence, they told her that abandoning the marriage would bring dishonor to the family. In spite of her family's wishes, Banas eventually ended their relationship, returning to the family home in July of 2005. Around that time, she started dating a man of her own choosing, whom the rest of her family disapproved of. particularly her father and uncle. In a meeting held at the latter's home in December of 2005, the family decided to kill both Banas and her new boyfriend for the shame they supposedly brought upon the community. On December the 2nd, Banas went to the police after overhearing a conversation about the murder plot between her uncle and mother. 10 days later, after law enforcement hadn't taken any action in connection with her report, she delivered a letter to the Wimbledon police station in which she provided the names of each of the relatives who wanted her dead. Then on New Year's Eve, the police were called to a cafe in Wimbledon where Banas said her father had made an attempt on her life. Officers noted that she was intoxicated, but she claimed it was her father who'd forced her to drink. She had cuts on her hands, having smashed a window during her escape, and was clearly in a distressed state. However, the police constable who responded to the scene didn't believe Banas's claims against her father, describing her as manipulative and melodramatic. The officer even wanted to criminally charge Banas for breaking the glass window. With nowhere else to turn, the young woman was forced to face her family's wrath. Without the aid of law enforcement, on January the 24th of 2006, Banas was sleeping at the family home alone. Later that morning, two of her cousins, along with a man by the name of Mohammed Marid Hama, arrived and subjected her to more than 2 hours of abuse and torture before fatally strangling her with a ligature. The following day, her boyfriend reported her missing to the police, who didn't take the report seriously at first. Banas's family insisted that she wasn't missing and that she was known to stay out overnight. The boyfriend ended up harassing the authorities into taking action, and the case was handed over to the Metropolitan Police Homicide and Serious Crime Command. Despite attempts by members of the wider Kurdish community to stymie the investigation, the police were able to arrest Mohammed Marid Hama in early February. While in custody, the suspect was covertly recorded as he bragged about the murder, implicating the victim's uncle, cousins, and father in the process. The recorded conversations, along with phone and vehicle tracking data, allowed law enforcement to locate Banas's remains in late April. A few days later, her uncle was arrested for murder. Her father faced the same charge 3 months later. In all, 7 individuals were criminally charged in connection with Banas's honor killing. Mohammed Marid Hama, as well as the victim's father and uncle, were each jailed for life. The 2 cousins present at the murder scene were likewise given life sentences, while a third cousin faced 8 years imprisonment. In the aftermath, the Independent Police Complaints Commission investigated law enforcement's handling of the situation leading up to Banas's murder. Although the commission found that the victim had been let down by the police, the constable who responded to the scene at the Wimbledon cafe was only given the lowest disciplinary sanction and was subsequently promoted. Number 4. Robb Elementary School shooting. Shortly after 11 a.m. on May the 24th of 2022, Texas teen Salvador Ramos shot his grandmother in the face following an argument over a phone bill at their Uvalde residence. The 18-year-old then got into his grandmother's pickup truck with a tactical vest and AR-15 style rifle in tow and made his way towards Robb Elementary School. Ramos sent a private Facebook message to a German teen he'd met online indicating his plans to commit a mass killing at his old elementary school. He crashed the truck through a barricade outside the school before hopping the fence to gain access to the grounds. Several 911 calls were placed about the crashed vehicle, prompting a school resource officer to drive to the campus. Upon his arrival, he pursued a teacher, whom he erroneously believed to be the perpetrator, driving right past Ramos in the process. As the latter was approaching the school building, an officer reportedly had his rifle aimed directly at him. However, the officer failed to subdue the impending school shooter because he didn't have authorization to fire from his supervisor. Ramos entered the building and walked down the hallway before entering classroom 111, which was internally connected to classroom 112. Testimony from surviving witnesses revealed that the young man announced, "You're all gonna die," before opening fire. The majority of the bloodshed took place within the next few minutes, but Ramos remained barricaded inside the classroom for over an hour while standing off with police. Uvalde law enforcement's response to the scene has been criticized for its lack of urgency and effectiveness. The Texas Department of Public Safety stated that prior to the arrival of tactical units, there were at least 19 police officers inside the school who made no effort to gain entry to the room where Ramos was holed up. According to further department findings, The decision to wait for the arrival of tactical units was made under the false belief that Ramos had been sequestered to a classroom where he could do no more harm. Arnulfo Reyes, a teacher in classroom 111, recounted how he heard law enforcement approach his classroom from what sounded like the hallway 3 times, but they didn't enter. On one such occasion, Reyes heard a student in the adjoining room shout, "Officer, we're in here, we're in here!" At which point, Ramos unloaded another barrage of bullets. Authorities were unable to establish negotiations with the suspect, and on body cam footage there was even a point where he was audibly and profanely taunting them as they waited to obtain a master key from the janitor to unlock the classroom door. Officers were joined by US Border Patrol tactical agents with a ballistic shield. There was evidence that the classroom door was unlocked the whole time, however, and law enforcement subsequently rushed inside. They were met with fire from Ramos, who was hiding in a closet, but they killed him with return fire. A report conducted by the Texas House of Representatives Investigative Committee found systemic failures and egregious poor decision-making by responding law enforcement. The report cited an unacceptably long period of time before officers breached the classroom and began rescue efforts. There were 22 fatalities as a result of the incident, including Ramos himself. Another 18 were injured, including Ramos's grandmother, who survived after being airlifted to a hospital in San Antonio. In the aftermath of the shooting, Robb Elementary was permanently closed and slated to be demolished. Number 3. Cleotha Henderson. During the early hours of July the 5th of 2021, a car pulled up to the loading dock on the grounds of FedEx Freight's operations facility at 461 Winchester Road in Memphis, Tennessee. A male suspect subsequently stole 7 television sets before fleeing the scene. At the time of the theft, the facility was closed for Independence Day, leaving only the security guard on the property. The man on duty that night was Cleotha Henderson, who'd managed to find and hold down a job in security despite his criminal record, which included a stint in prison less than a year earlier. 12 days later, FedEx Freight suffered a second break-in during which 2 male suspects entered the property through a dock door before pilfering several boxes of Nike apparel worth a total of $2,500. An affidavit of complaint the following month listed Henderson as the suspect in both thefts, and a warrant was thus issued for his arrest. Given his record, the man could have faced an additional 2 to 4 years in prison if convicted of the burglaries. A couple of months later, Henderson began talking to a woman on a dating app. The pair met in person for the first time on September the 21st, about a week after they'd initially begun conversing. The woman, identified as 22-year-old Alicia Franklin, later told investigators that upon meeting up with Henderson, he pulled out a gun, blindfolded her, and took her to a vacant lot behind the lakes at Ridgeway apartment complex where he abused her. Franklin immediately reported the crime to Memphis police. The young woman didn't receive the urgent response from law enforcement that she was hoping for, and the case subsequently languished without any further developments for the better part of a year. In June of 2022, Henderson was taken into custody in connection with the FedEx burglaries, but the charges were dropped because of a lack of evidence and the man was released. On September the 2nd of 2022, Henderson stalked a woman who was out for an early morning jog on the University of Memphis campus. He eventually forced her into his car at gunpoint and killed her. The victim was identified as teacher, mother of 2, and business heiress Eliza Fletcher. 3 days later, her body was found behind an abandoned house following a massive search effort by local authorities. Memphis police identified Henderson as a suspect and took him back into custody on murder charges. Following his latest arrest, investigators finally linked him to Franklin's assault almost a year after the fact. He consequently faced charges in connection with that incident as well. Franklin subsequently filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis, alleging that the police's failure to properly investigate her attack had enabled Henderson to victimize Fletcher, this time to the extent of murder. In a 25-page court filing, city officials admitted that law enforcement had been aware of Franklin's report all the way back in September of 2021. However, they refuted that the young woman had been able to positively identify her attacker to officers. Franklin questioned why DNA evidence of her assault was left to sit on a shelf in a crime lab for nearly a year before being examined. She also claimed to have suffered emotional damages as a result of the ordeal. In February of 2023, Henderson pleaded not guilty to his various crimes. He was subsequently due back in court in late March. Around that time, Judge Mary Wagner of the Shelby County Circuit Court submitted an order dismissing Franklin's lawsuit. Number 2. Queensland First Nations women. In the summer of 2022, a whistleblower from the Queensland Police Service publicly claimed that department officials had instructed her to withhold evidence of police failures in multiple domestic violence cases. The officer, who wished to remain anonymous, had been on the force for more than 20 years, working as a police liaison to the Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Unit of the State Coroner's Office. According to her allegations, there had been at least 4 separate domestic violence cases involving First Nations women over a 6-month period, all of which were not properly investigated by senior officers. In each case, the Indigenous victims were eventually killed by their partners, but their deaths were officially investigated as drug overdoses. The whistleblower said she was criticized by colleagues within the police department, who complained when she sent the cases to the coroner's office for further review. She also claimed that reports about police involvement in family violence-related deaths were regularly redacted, removing information regarding inadequate police actions and/or inaction. In 2021, the officer made a formal complaint to the Crime and Corruption Commission about the request to withhold evidence. The commission then moved to investigate her claims, but placed the internal review in the hands of a police officer whose direct supervisor was one of the 2 senior officers named in the complaint. The whistleblower asked for the case to be relocated to someone who could be trusted to review the data impartially. Her request was denied, and the investigation ultimately found no evidence of police wrongdoing. If you still haven't stilled your "they will kill you" cravings just yet, then we still have our video from a while back about 9 times the justice system failed completely, lined up for you right after number 1. Number 1. John Wharton. On the morning of February the 8th of 2013, police in the village of Franklin in Birmingham, England, received a call from a 9-year-old girl who said she was unable to wake either of her parents. The child noted that her mother's face had been swollen the night before and also indicated that her father had been looking after her mother. Authorities immediately noticed that there was a high-risk domestic violence marker on the residence. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes, whereupon they determined that both 34-year-old Suzanne Van Hagen and her partner, John Wharton, were deceased. The child who made the call had found Van Hagen, her mother, lying dead beside a mattress in the bedroom, while Wharton, her father, was in the living room. First responders brought the child to nearby Birmingham Children's Hospital, where it was determined that she was unharmed. During the resulting police investigation, it emerged that 37-year-old Wharton had been abusive throughout his and Van Hagen's relationship. The first signs of physical abuse came in 2011, when the woman's hairdresser noticed she had a black eye. Van Hagen claimed to have sustained the injury in a quad bike accident, but the hairdresser, as well as Van Hagen's loved ones, knew that wasn't true. The woman's sisters subsequently confronted Wharton, who became furious and aggressive. His demeanor grew so hostile that the sisters eventually needed to leave the house for fear of being physically attacked themselves. Over the course of the next 18 months, Van Hagen became increasingly isolated from her family before ceasing all contact with them altogether. The Van Hagens tried repeatedly to notify police and social services of the threat Wharton posed to Suzanne and the couple's daughter. They were largely ignored, however, despite Wharton's past criminal convictions, which had led to him spending some time in a mental hospital. While investigating the crime scene on February the 8th, authorities noted that there were strangulation marks on Van Hagen's neck, leading to the assumption that Wharton had murdered her. Officers informed the victim's relatives of their belief that she'd been killed by her partner. However, a post-mortem examination revealed the presence of drugs in the systems of both deceased, so investigators pivoted. They started running with the working theory that the couple had accidentally overdosed during an intimate game. A press release was even issued to that effect in March of 2013, which thoroughly angered Van Hagen's family. They knew that she'd been murdered, but the police were seemingly unwilling to make that determination in spite of the abundance of evidence. In 2017, West Midlands Police finally commenced a review of the officer's actions before and after Van Hagen's death. The report described a series of failures by those involved in the investigation, concluding that Van Hagen and her child should have been removed from the abusive household long before the situation escalated out of control. It also stated that law enforcement's decision to shut down the homicide investigation following the discovery of drugs in the couple's systems had been misguided. West Midlands Police neglected to make a public comment on the report for 4 whole years. On September the 10th of 2021, the department uploaded a YouTube video of their Chief Constable, David Thompson, reading an apology to the Van Hagen family. Despite the admission of failure, the department still refrained from calling Van Hagen's death a homicide and didn't even send a link to their YouTube apology to the family, who had to look it up themselves. In 2022, it was reported that the couple's daughter, now 18 years old, was slated to study nursing at university. Number 8. Denise Keane Barnett. London police officer Sandeep Koon was fired from her position after her failure to investigate domestic abuse claims led to Denise Keane Barnett's death on April the 16th of 2020. The victim had contacted authorities about her former partner, 45-year-old Darion Simmons, whom she accused of assaulting her on multiple occasions, as well as hiding a camera in one of the bedroom's light bulbs to spy on her. Koon was assigned to the case, and 36-year-old Keane Barnett reportedly expressed her desire to press charges against the man. However, the officer repeatedly cancelled interviews, neglected to directly investigate Simmons, and didn't offer the victim any safety measures to prevent further instances of violence. Koon officially closed the inquiry just 10 days before Simmons set Keane Barnett on fire and burned her alive. The victim was rushed to the ER with severe burn wounds but died shortly thereafter. Simmons was consequently sentenced to 32 years behind bars. In October of 2020, an investigation was launched into Koon's actions by an independent disciplinary panel, which concluded that the police officer was in fact guilty of gross misconduct, leading to her dismissal from the force. Number 7. Casey Brittle. On October the 3rd of 2010, British woman Casey Brittle was beaten to death by her ex-boyfriend, 27-year-old Sanchez Williams, after her repeated calls for help were ignored by the authorities. Over the span of 2 years, 21-year-old Brittle had contacted Nottingham police about her partner's violent tendencies upwards of 11 times, but officers failed to intervene on her behalf. Williams, who had a long history of arrests for other offenses, received multiple warnings for his outbursts against Brittle, but no domestic violence charges were ever filed, in spite of the overwhelming evidence of abuse and stalking. The victim's young daughter was present at the scene during the violent assault that claimed her life, but the child was fortunately left unharmed. After news of Brittle's murder became public, 6 police officers admitted to neglect of duty, but none of them were discharged. 1 was written up, 3 others received management advice, while the 2 remaining men suffered no repercussions whatsoever. An autopsy conducted by medical examiners determined that the victim had suffered 27 separate injuries to the face and head, inflicted by some sort of blunt object. Number 6. Ashley Barlow. Texas resident Ashley Barlow was shot to death by her estranged husband, Terry, after asking him for a divorce. On October the 23rd of 2021, Ashley's family told local police that the couple had undergone a recent separation and that Terry, then aged 53, had been abusive for most of their marriage. The victim's sister indicated that the 37-year-old woman had voiced concerns about her husband's escalating pattern of violence and that she felt her life might be in danger. Images that investigators retrieved from a store security camera showed the man confronting his wife and a second individual, angrily screaming at them before pulling out a gun. The recording showed Terry driving away before soon returning, at which point he proceeded to chase his former partner while firing the weapon in her direction, eventually killing her. Ashley's companion reportedly escaped the attack unharmed. Terry again drove away from the scene, then returned soon after and surrendered to the police. Following his arrest, the man refused to plead guilty, rejecting a plea bargain that would have sentenced him to 50 years in prison in lieu of a full-scale murder trial. Terry faced a possible sentence of 99 years to life if convicted by a jury. Number 5. Joshua Fitzpatrick. 36-year-old Arizona resident Joshua Fitzpatrick died on March the 31st of 2018 as a direct result of police negligence during a home invasion. The victim's wife, Katrina Smith, had contacted 911 after Curtis Bagley had broken into the family's Phoenix residence. Smith hid underneath the bed while she spoke with the operator, but was unaware that her husband had been stabbed multiple times by the intruder. Although police arrived at the scene within minutes and immediately apprehended Bagley, they failed to perform a sweep of the house for over 20 minutes. Body cam footage showed the responding officers joking with the suspect and blowing chewing gum bubbles, while Fitzpatrick bled to death on the other side of the front door. In a subsequent lawsuit, Smith accused the police department of causing her extreme emotional distress and directly leading to her husband's death. Her lawyers also denounced the city of Phoenix for neglectfully releasing 38-year-old Bagley from prison 2 weeks prior to the attack and failing to provide him with proper treatments for his diagnosed mental ailments. Arizona authorities ultimately agreed to pay the victim's family $2 million in compensation for their consequential shortcomings. Number 4. Linda Vilica. After failure to investigate abuse allegations led to Linda Vilica's death at the hands of her estranged husband on August the 11th of 2019, British police officer Finlay Clark was found guilty of misconduct in connection to the case. 41-year-old Vilica had contacted Essex authorities over threatening messages sent by her former partner, Wilfred Jacob, whom she also accused of planting recording devices inside her home. Officer Clark, who responded to the initial 999 call, turned off her body camera upon her arrival at the scene, neglected to arrest Jacob and filed an inaccurate report of the victim's allegations. 8 days later, suspicious that Vilica was seeing other men, Jacob fatally stabbed her in a premeditated attack. The man reportedly waited until the victim's brother, who lived with her at the time, left for the day before pouncing. He was eventually found guilty of murder and in January of 2020 was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison. After the case was reviewed by a disciplinary panel at the Chelmsford Civic Centre, Officer Clark received a written warning for failing to undertake an adequate investigation. Number 3. Kerry Power. In 2013, school administrative assistant Kerry Power called the police in Plymouth, England on several occasions concerned over her former partner's increasingly violent behavior. 36-year-old Power told officers that she was being stalked by her ex, David Wilder, and was scared he might seriously injure her. The authorities informed Power that she could make a silent call to 999 if she was unable to speak during a domestic incident. However, they failed to properly explain the protocol, and when Wilder broke into Power's house on the night of December the 14th of 2013, the operator hung up on her, believing it to have been an accidental call. The operator asked Power to cough, make a sound, or press 55 in order to indicate she required immediate assistance, but Power, unaware of the so-called silent solutions protocol, put the phone down after dialing 999. Wilder contacted the police the following morning, admitting to having murdered his former partner. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 2014, a misconduct inquiry concluded that officers had failed to properly investigate previous domestic abuse allegations leading up to the murder. Number 2. Tara Brown. On September the 8th of 2015, 24-year-old Tara Brown was murdered by her ex-partner, Lionel Patia, after the police in Queensland, Australia had failed to investigate her domestic violence allegations. 5 days before her death, Brown had attempted to obtain a protection order against 25-year-old Patia following an incident in which he'd pinned her down on her bed and threatened to stab her with a pair of scissors. She showed police over 270 threatening messages he'd sent between 3 a.m. and 1 p.m. of that same day. The officers that received her complaint didn't believe the messages constituted domestic violence, and thus chose not to take statements from either the victim's mother or lawyer who'd witnessed the instances of abuse take place. Brown's petition was rejected and she was told to make a private domestic violence application if she so desired. No official police investigation was opened regarding Patia's threats of further violence. On the 8th, the man crashed his car into the victim and used a steel water hydrant cover to strike her over the face more than 30 times. Brown, who'd become trapped underneath her upturned car, was unable to defend herself from the onslaught. 2 officers were disciplined following an internal inquiry, and there was considerable turnover in the police brass as a result of the misconduct and neglect investigation. Number 1. Darion Haley Henderson Bellman. On July the 28th of 2020, Ontario woman Darion Haley Henderson Bellman, aged 25, was murdered by her on-again, off-again boyfriend Darnell Reed. After her death, the victim's grandparents suggested that 27-year-old Reed should have been in jail on the day of the attack, but he'd reportedly been released due to COVID concerns. The man had been arrested earlier that year in May for illegally owning a firearm and had been ordered to stay at least 300 feet away from Henderson Bellman. Reed was detained 4 times for violating the restriction order in the past. He was released from jail with a GPS tracker, but Henderson Bellman's family claimed that he wasn't being properly monitored. After fatally shooting his ex-girlfriend, Reed unsuccessfully attempted to take his own life and was hospitalized due to his self-inflicted wounds. He remained at the hospital for 7 months before being charged with first-degree murder in March of 2021. Thanks for watching. Would you rather have a 911 dispatcher hang up on you in the middle of an emergency or lose the ability to move your arms during a skydive? Let us know in the comments section below.